Hello, and welcome to the Modern Romantic Podcast, where we celebrate and inspire romanticism through passionate people doing incredible things. Hi, I'm an incredible armoire, Trey, and I'm joined, and I'm joined by one of the best. I can't think of something. One of the best co-hosts that I've ever had.
Oh, that's so nice.
You're welcome, Emily. Hi, Emily.
Hi. I was totally unprepared for. Am I supposed to pick like what piece of furniture I would resemble, or that I
No,
am most like?
I would not say resemble. I would say a piece of furniture that you identify with.
Okay, because I thought it was like one of those Beauty and the Beast, like be our guest moments where like I could be a candelabra. You get to be the armoire.
I do get it.
Oops.
Well, the armoire did sing opera, so I mean, it just kind of fit.
This is me. I'm a candelabra.
Let me find some makeshift doors. One second.
You'd be like,
You can't see me. All right. I am really excited to talk to our guest today. Emily, will you please introduce our guest?
of course. Tonight we welcome Jennifer Costa, an artist and professor whose work blurs the line between sculpture and function, which I think is really cool. She's influenced by Art Deco and Art Nouveau. Her designs evolve with each piece, and she is a professor at Illinois. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong. Illinois Central College. Central Illinois College.
No,
No,
Illinois
Illinois
Central. You
Central.
got it
See, I
right.
keep switching them. Anyway, Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for being here. Uh,
Oh, go ahead.
no, truly one of the things that I like. What drew me to your work in particular was the fact that one, you used Art Deco and Art Nouveau, which are two of my like really favorite art movements.
Same.
Backing up just a little bit though, how did you even get started in art in general?
Well, that is a very good question. Originally, my grandfather was a cabinet maker many, many, many years ago. He was originally from Massachusetts and New Bedford area, and so growing up, he was always building things and doing things. And my dad had always told me that, your grandfather, he was a cabinet maker. He did all these great pieces. And so it kind of, my grandfather taught my dad some stuff, but then my dad was going to the vocational high school. So he was going to go into woodworking. And then he wound up doing something totally and completely different in college. So it was just that idea of coming from not necessarily an art family and art background, but a maker background, my parents bought a house that was built in 1910 when I was in middle school. And so they fixed it up and everything. So it was we're going to go and spend the weekend fixing up this house and doing things. So here's a hammer, go do this type thing. So it was always instilled in me that, yes, you can use power tools. Yes, you can do this. Here, we need your help with this. Let's do this type of thing. And then my mother, always, when I was a little kid, whenever we would go over to friends' houses or things like that, because my brothers were always older than me, that I went along. And so my mother always had things for me to do. She'd always got me coloring books or like crochet hooks or just something. So it was the start making stuff to keep occupied. And that just kind of led into the really enjoying making art.
I love that it was the thing of like go make something and not just like occupy your time, because there could be like distractors, but the fact that you actually made something physical from that work, that's really incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did you find your way into Art Deco and Art Nouveau, or what attracted you to those art movements?
Well, I'd always liked the idea of functional work. My degree is, both my undergraduate and my graduate degree are in sculpture, not necessarily furniture design or woodworking or anything. So I am from North Carolina and from Asheville area. and it is a big arts and crafts kind of area, and historically, and still is. So it's basically a lot of artists are there. And it helped that there was this idea of artists making functional pieces like pottery and quilts and things like that that you could use. So that led into my desire to make something useful, and probably going back to my grandfather always making things that were useful, like cabinets and sewing cabinets and things like that. And just the idea of Art Nouveau with the lines of it. Like, I like Art Nouveau and Art Deco, but Art Nouveau is like it's there for me. And then like arts and crafts is there for me. I've always been fascinated with things like the wallpaper designs with William Morris, and just the curvilinear aspect of it. Like, I do like making work that leans more towards like deco and like very square, but there's something about that curvilinear piece that like you have to stop and look at it, and just the design of the utilitarian things. And so Art Deco and Art Nouveau were very much a style that everything was functional. I mean, we had like the decorative arts, but there were still things like, look, here's a teapot and it is beautiful, and yet it is functional. We can use it. So it's the ability to have things that look nice and be functional, instead of let's just deal purely with that functional aspect of it.
The thing that I like about Art Nouveau so much is really kind of rooted in like Alphonse Mucha, where there's so much symmetry there. But the thing that helps break it up are those little extra like filigree movements, or the way that the figure is posed on that page. So you get something that's almost perfectly symmetrical, but at the same time, it's broken up just a little bit by all of these like slightly added elements to things. And so when it gets translated into the real world and you get these like almost symmetrical pieces, but then there's just something that's so natural about it. For me, that's what makes me stop and go, ooh, okay.
There's just something about it that draws you in. And it's the same reason for me why some people like abstract expressionism in paintings, or they really like minimalist type paintings. It's like there's just something in it that it's the curves, it's the dynamic line of those curves. So they go from like really like broad curves into these teeny tiny little curves, like the Mucha posters and things like that. And that tends to be something like, he's one of those artists that inspires me because of that, for that same reason that you talked about, that it's symmetrical, but not really, because you've got all these extra little details that are thrown in there. And I think that Art Nouveau has so many extra little details that it becomes like a little treat when you are looking at this main thing, but then you look, oh wait, where's that line go to? And oh wait, I never even noticed that,
For sure. Because of the human being I am, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you how you felt about the elves in Lord of the Rings.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know, because I saw them such a long time ago.
Okay.
And I'm not, honestly, everybody will crucify me, I'm not a big fan of Lord of the Rings.
We will forgive you because you are involved with what you do.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
It's mostly because a lot of people compare the elven style and their architecture and their furniture and their dress and everything to Art Nouveau, and the dwarves are say it's a nod to Art Deco in how their like structures and things like that are, and just generally their aesthetic. So because of that, I thought I'd bring it up, because I thought maybe these were things that resonated with you somehow.
Well, I mean, I could see it, because like Art Nouveau, to me, it's imbued in nature, like with all of the plants and things like that. So that's going to be much more nature oriented. And whereas Art Deco is very like it's industrial.
Yeah, and that matches who the elves and the dwarves are in those stories. So that makes sense.
So you got your degrees in sculpture, and I'm curious, what did some of your first pieces look like? How would you describe them?
Um, they were functional. I'm a very practical person. I obviously I love art because I teach it, and that's what my degree is in. But for me personally, like there's sculpture takes up so much room
Mhm.
that not many people will have a lot of sculpture in like their house. You know, it's a lot easier to have a painting or a photograph or a drawing and put it on the wall. We have tons of walls. But then when you're dealing with things like tables and cabinets and things like that, then it's those are functional because those can also go up against a wall. Sculpture in itself sits on a pedestal and it's right there. So my earliest pieces in undergraduate school, honestly, I don't remember from like the beginning sculpture classes, other than like, okay, we're going to learn how to weld, we're going to learn how to cast bronze and things like that. So that was not the functional aspect of it. I didn't get into function until like senior year of undergraduate school when I was working on my thesis for undergraduate school. And it was that there's only so many things that I can make that you can sit on a table. You know, there's only so many things that I can make. So I did the typical what everybody does in when they first start out with sculpture is that you get a bunch of pieces that are a bunch of different shapes and sizes of steel. You assemble them together, kind of like David Smith, and then you weld them together. And then at that point in time, let's paint them all these bright colors like Calder, and voila, you've got art. I'm like, this is taking up a lot of room and I can't really do a whole lot with it. So senior year, it was I have to come up with a thesis. And my stuff was decent. It wasn't great. But then the whole like, oh, I kind of like this idea of a chair. Let's think about making chairs out of steel because we normally have them out of wood. Or upholstered. So I would cut out pieces and I would weld these chairs and I would upholster them in this really crazy crushed velvet. So
Okay.
That sounds awesome.
I have crushed purple velvet.
Oh yeah.
Red velvet. It was great. And then some of them I even cast in aluminum. So those got a little heavy. And so I learned a lot about the chair. And so that was the first like stuff that I really made that was going to lead to my style. And I hadn't really gotten into Art Nouveau yet. I really appreciated it. I really loved it, but it was beyond my capabilities at that point in time. So the earliest stuff that I have is very more towards like Art Deco because everything was just like square and industrial. So it wasn't until I got to graduate school and started taking some woodworking classes, and I learned how to arc weld in undergraduate school, and I didn't learn how to MIG until graduate school. So I was like, ooh, this goes so much faster with the MIG welder than with the arc welder. And so the ability to make my own shapes versus this is what we found at the glorious scrapyard
Right.
thing. So it just kind of evolved from those initial pieces of that, like I said, that everybody does. Let's just start assembling things and then call it kind of a combination between Smith and Calder, paint it, woohoo, yay, and then it just kind of grew from there.
Honestly, that makes a lot of sense. And you said something on your website where people say that function follows form, but then it sounds like your thesis was also like form can also follow function, and it's making sure that the two of those are in symmetry with each other, or a lot more in tandem than they are like two completely different things.
Absolutely. And that tends to be an argument that a lot of architects deal with. I originally thought that I was going to go to school to be an architect.
Mhm.
So I wasn't really certain about taking art classes. And it was the whole like, oh, in high school, I took art. I loved it. It was great. And then I went for a year and I didn't take it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm miserable. And like the artists and everybody will totally understand that. So then took ceramics in high school and was like, okay, I always have to do something art wise. So I also took drafting. So I was like, well, I think I might be an architect. So the original plan was that I was going to stay at home for 2 years, go to University of North Carolina at Asheville for 2 years, and then transfer to NC State and try and get into the architecture program and become an architect. Well, at that point in time in the 90s, which I don't know what I was thinking because I totally could have done it. It was there's not many women in the field of architecture at that point, but yet I'm like, yeah, there weren't a ton of women in the field of sculpture either, but for some reason I decided to go ahead with that. But once I took my first art class at UNC Asheville, I was like, yeah, no, I'm going into art. So.
It opened the door and said, come on through.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Art does that.
Yeah, I know. And we love it for that.
I'm curious your take, though, being that you've got your thesis that was a blend of form follows function and function follows form.
Right.
And this blending of like Art Deco and the love of Art Nouveau, those are like two complete opposite things. So how do you encourage your students to find the middle ground between function and form, and then these like two very contrasting ideas?
Well, they aren't contrasting if you think about it, because you can't have one without the other. If you're going to do something that is functional, well, you can. Anybody like you've got a log outside that you cut off that you're sitting on for a bonfire. Yeah, that's functional. Is it comfortable? Not really. So you have to have things that work well visually, but yet if you have something that is as pretty can be, and then you go to sit in it and it's not comfortable, you're not going to last very long in it. So you have to have both. And I apologize, I got sidetracked. The whole idea of like architects tend to deal with that. Like you can't have a purely functional building. It's going to be pretty ugly. I mean, if it works great, but nobody wants to go into a boring building. I mean, they will, but they're not going to be happy about it. It's that idea of going into a building that is beautiful, but yet that building still has to be functional. You still have to have elevators. You still have to have accurate and proper lighting for it. You still have to have accessibility. So for things that are functional, they have to go hand in hand with form and function. And that's like, you could have an entire semester in a philosophy class and argue. It's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Trey, this is somebody after my own heart. But do you know why? Because I believe if Jennifer made costumes, they would all have pockets.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Or
we believe in that.
Yes, we do.
Or the modern fashion industry would actually give women's jeans actual like deep pockets.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. I was actually talking to somebody at school like that the other day. I was like, look at my pocket. It is that deep. That is not functional.
It goes up to my first knuckle.
I was like, my phone's going to fall out. He's like, just get jeans that work for you. Just get them. You're fine.
Yep. But where? Right? Where? At some point, you're buying jeans like Ariat or Carhartt just to get pockets.
Right. Exactly.
Thank you to those brands, by the way.
Yeah. And Carhartt, I'm sorry, but Carhartt, I love their jackets for women because I'm short. Okay. I am like 5'1" and a smidge over. And so every jacket that I get, like the sleeve is all the way down to here and whatnot, and it's too long. So they actually make them and they fit me And
Oh.
they have pockets on the inside. So you can, like, I don't know, put your phone in it and not have to worry about it falling out. And I don't know, have pockets for your gloves and stuff. It's great. So they at least get that whole, like, form and function have to work together for us.
So I'll ask, I'm going to caveat the original question. For those students who come in with tunnel vision on either side, how do you get them to see the form? How do you get them to see the function?
Good question.
One, it depends upon the assignment. And two, like today we just had a critique on a cardboard assignment, and it's one of those assignments that actually came out of COVID. And I was like, oh, great, let's cut up some cardboard. So it's teaching them how to cut cardboard and glue it together and assemble it in the style of David Smith. And I tell them that this is purely a non-objective piece. So we are dealing 100% with the form. There is no function to it other than the enjoyment of art. There's no like useful purpose in terms of like a cup that you drink out of, or a chair that you sit in, or a table that you sit at. But craftsmanship wise, it still has to be good. So leading into that whole like form and function, that functional aspect of it deals with kind of the craftsmanship aspect of it. If it's something like this that was non-objective, you have to make sure that it's not going to fall apart. So if you make a chair that is functional, when somebody sits in it, it has to fit them. It cannot fall apart when they sit in it. Otherwise, bad things happen. There used to be in the architecture program years ago where, same thing, form and function, they gave a cardboard chair assignment. And I would give my sculpture students, my 3D students, that same assignment. It's like, build a chair, design a chair purely out of cardboard. So the fun part was that, like I said, I'm like 5'1", and the architecture professor who was there at the time, yeah, he's 6'3". So there is a huge disparity between our heights. So he would tell his students, by the way, Jennifer is going to be here for the crit. It has to fit me and it has to fit her. So that means I don't want my feet dangling above the ground, and that it can't be too low that he sinks to the floor. So telling the students that they have to find the middle ground between form and function, and sometimes they'll get it, sometimes they don't. It's one of those things that I teach at a 2-year college, so I have freshman, sophomore. So they're not as, like, the ones that have been there for a few years and that wind up taking like independent study or like the studio practicum classes, they've gone through it a little bit more. So then it starts to dawn upon them, and they start to recognize and realize that whole like, oh, so this is what they're talking about. But initially, it is the hardest thing to get students to understand how those things work together, because they just have tunnel vision for one thing.
I think for the longest time, I was very much a form person, not a function. And then, I don't know what was the switch, but I can recognize appreciating both sides of the conversation.
And it tends to be a lot harder. Some people will never get it. I am never going to be a painter. I am never going to be able to make a good composition on a canvas. I can make a decent composition, but I'm never going to be able to do the things that the painters that teach painting at school can do, because that's their field. Whereas they're going to have a harder time understanding form and function, because it is a very sculptural concept. Even Alexander Calder with his mobiles, they had a function they had to turn. So he had to work with that form to get it to where it was balanced enough to where it would actually spin and rotate like it was supposed to, and it wouldn't do this, you know?
Interesting. So I'm curious, Emily, from your standpoint, you called out pockets a little bit ago, and that's
Yeah.
mostly like from the sewing standpoint. So there is both form and function. What are some other form and function things from a sewing aspect that maybe we haven't talked about, or we as a general public haven't really considered?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, our clothing has evolved in this day and age to where it's more function than form. I guess like fashion pushes those boundaries, and we have things like, Alexander McQueen, who does both well, who's no longer with us, but you get the idea of modern runway with its avant-garde shows tends to do that, and that's kind of what I loved about some of the recycled designs I did, because I could go over the top like that, or that's kind of what I liked about the wow factor was I can make something that no one would ever wear on the street, but it was over the top beautiful, and it didn't have to have pockets, but it still had pockets because I believe in that wholeheartedly.
They could be hidden perfectly.
Yeah. So you look at like some of these. I want to say there's some meme out there with I want to say it's like Kanye or some rapper that's wearing like a crazy oversized scarf. And like, it's insane. Yeah, it's going to keep you warm because it's bigger than your comforter on your bed. But like, I might be wrong on this, on who it was, but there are things like that where it's like, okay, we've done this for the sake of beauty, or we've done this for the sake of fashion. They say fashion isn't comfortable. Like, if you're really into it, you wear an uncomfortable dress or an uncomfortable suit or an uncomfortable garment of any kind one time, and you understand then that this one's form over function. Because I'm pretty, but I'm super uncomfortable, and I hate myself for choosing this, or a bad pair of shoes. Like, the shoes don't fit, but man, are they glorious.
They look pretty.
So I think we can run into those things fairly easily, but we definitely don't do it as often as I think at some point in history we used to, with things like a hoop skirt, or some of the more outrageous like shoulder pads of the 80s became like you can still wear the jacket, but like it has these big shoulder pads. It takes more fabric, it takes more design time, it takes more it's more expensive. All of these things take more. Just like architecture, it takes more to make a cool looking building than just a box that you can put some people into work for a day. So I believe it probably exists in a lot of art as well, not just clothing. Clothing just happens to have a lot of function too.
Right.
I'd say that. I'm still, I mean, so I'm more or less just now, it's becoming more of just a thing to kind of recognize. So I love that we're having this conversation to kind of spur this focus on, can it be both? And yet it sounds like, yes, it can. We just have to be very cognizant of that as we look at through these different pieces of art. Let's see. Fly tying is a form of function. Archer in our chat says fly tying is a form of function. Is a form and function exercise. I will get this right. It's got to look right, as well as float or swim right, and hold up to being dunked in the river. Very true.
Very true. Yeah, it's got to look enough like a bug for a fish to eat it, or whatever it is you're trying to make it look like the fish will eat.
Right. And it's something that, like, I've been dealing with this whole idea of form and function for a long time. So for me, it's not necessarily a new conversation. Partly because I think that my degree is in sculpture. They're like, okay, that's nice. It's functional. However, you need to make sure that it would still pass as a sculpture that has good form, even if you never use it?
I'm going to say something controversial, and this is about music.
Okay.
Um, the reason this has spurred something in me because I have an aversion to very modern music. Um, more specifically, very modern classical music, because it gets so avant-garde that sometimes I miss like the form of things, and I feel like it's doing it purely out of function. So like atonal music, or where you get there's not really an underlying like thematic quality to it. It's just being for more or less weird for the sake of being weird. And I kind of lose either the form or the function in that. So that's kind of why this is striking such a chord with me. Not to make a pun on music, but there we are.
Would it be different if the music was accompanying something that made more sense? Like if it was an over arc in a movie scene that was had that flavor to it.
Maybe there's a section of the musical that I really like, Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, where during the show they go to the opera, and the characters are commenting on how weird and how strangely that the people on stage are acting and like um, contorting their bodies with which to convey this story. And underneath, you get this underscore of some of the weirdest music I have ever heard, and it works. From like just listening to that section, it works, and I can see what they're doing on stage. But if that is the entirety of the piece, no.
Okay.
That's kind of where for me that line kind of gets crossed.
So if there's no context for you.
Yeah, I would say if there's no context or it doesn't help the storytelling of the piece, mm-mm, no, no thanks. Um, so for so for you with sculpture and getting into you, I've seen that you've now started mixing media together, like wood and steel, and all of these different kind of pieces together. What has been your favorite combination that
Mm.
has surprised you?
Um, well, I really liked initially the combination of wood and steel. So I would do a lot of, I switched to tables when I was in grad school. We switched from chairs oh, a table, I can stick it up against a wall. I switched to those. And so I did a lot of like cast aluminum legs and then steel tabletops with like wooden inserts. So I kind of like had a little bit of everything going on. I haven't done those in a while because I've really lately gotten way more into just the traditional wood and stained glass type furniture.
Is that piece that's behind you now something you made?
Yes,
Of course. I think it's gorgeous.
thank you.
I was I was had this in my head like do you like are you when you're at home do you ever go, "Man, I need a new table. I'm just going to go make one."
Sometimes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or do you
Oh,
do you have this intention where you're like, "Okay, I want my house to look like this, so I want all of these pieces to be cohesive," or do you do that?
no, I don't make them cohesive in that sense. Like they don't need to match per
Okay.
se, like in terms of like the type of wood or anything. It's the if I feel like making it, like if I have a need for something like myself, like the piece that I think you probably saw, the peacock cabinet that I made
Mhm.
that's on
Yeah.
my website. That's mine. I made that for me.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm so
yes.
happy that's yours.
Yeah, and it's my height, so it is 61 inches tall, and I tended to incorporate a lot of things that I have been fascinated with, like the arts and crafts style and things like that with it, and like I felt a need to make something for myself because I had done commission pieces and I'd never really done anything. Like I made a bed for myself. I got to make another one. And like, there's only same thing. There's only so many tables that I can have. And I'm like, I need some cabinets to put some stuff in. So I got to the point where I'm like, there's a cabinet that I want to make now that I'm like, I need to make, this is totally a functional cabinet. I need to make a cabinet that will hold all my body sprays, all my perfumes. So in my mind, I'm like, well, let's see, the bottles are all 8 inches tall and they're only like this deep. So what am I going to do with them? How am I going to store them? So I want them to look nice. Like I want that aspect of, I don't want to see a ton of just stuff that's sitting out and about. And if it's behind glass in a cabinet, it's a like functional aspect of it. One, it holds it, and two, there's less cleaning that I have to do because there's less stuff that I have to dust around. It's just dust the cabinet and then I'm good, you know? So if I see a need for myself for something, then I'll go ahead and I'll make it, you know?
Of course.
For those looking at it, you can take a look more at pieces that that Jennifer's created at jennifercostastudio.com. The cabinet that she's referring to, you can see a very large picture under the stained glass section, or you can look at the cabinet in its entirety under the cabinets and chests section, along with many other delightful pieces.
On that peacock cabinet, you made the little metal piece that the keyhole is in.
Yeah.
Did you make that too?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is glorious.
Yeah, I cast that in bronze, and I actually have another one that I cast, but I haven't cleaned up yet. And I don't know what it's going to go on. I just know that I will put it on something at some point in time. And I tend to do that too, where I'll have this idea, like when I teach sculpture, I'm like, oh, we're going to do bronze casting. Then I do a piece. So that way I can show them how to gate it and how to invest it and do all that. I'm like, well, if they're making something, I may as well cast something myself. And I don't have any idea specifically. I just go, I like this design. And then sometimes I will design an entire piece around whatever it is that I wanted to cast, you know? So sometimes it'll sit for, 3-4 years until I get around with an idea and go, oh, that's what I want to do, you know? So I don't force it.
It happens to us too with fabric.
Yeah, right?
Literally gonna say
Oh
the
my
same
God, I
thing.
love this, but I don't know what I want to do, what I want to make yet.
Yep.
But I have to
relatable.
have it. So yeah, I know.
So stained glass, was that something you learned in school?
Actually, no. I first learned going back to my parents bought a house that was built in 1910.
Yeah.
My dad used to work for Owens Corning when he was in his 20s. And so he learned how to cut glass and things like that long time ago. And so going back to trying to help out with fixing up the house, this window pane is broken. Here's how you cut glass. So he showed me how to do that when I was in like the 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. No, I think it was like 7th grade. So I did that, did the panes, did all the glazing, all that kind of stuff that I helped out with. And then I never touched it again until maybe about 12 years ago, something like that, maybe 15, maybe 15. I can't remember. And it was just one of those things like, I really like the stained glass that, Frank Lloyd Wright, and with like Chicago area with all the Frank Lloyd Wright houses and his studio, and then Green and Green, that you'll see a lot of glass work for them, like falling back into that whole, like my fascination with architecture. I'm like, ooh, that looks so pretty. I would like to do that. I can do that. I know how to cut glass. And so over the years, he's told me like how to do things in glass and whatnot. And like he showed me how to solder like for something else. And so it just wound up leading and building into it. And that's actually one of the things that I have my students do every semester. It's like they like it at the end, but they hate it when I give it to them. I call it the learn a new skill. And they have to completely research, like pick some kind of a skill that involves 3D, and you'll like this because sewing is there. So they can hand sew, they can sew with the sewing machine. I've got a student now that he's going to learn how to sew with the sewing machine. And I'm like, that's great, but you have to research it and they have to learn the history of it. So they have to look up the history of
all right.
They have to learn the sewing machine. I'm like, you don't need to learn every single little thing, but you need to know what a bobbin is. And you need to know what the lever is called, and you need to know how this works. Like, you got to at least be able to identify and tell us what you've learned. And so then they have to research it and they have to practice it. So it's things like crochet, knitting. It's very craft oriented because that tends to be like the easiest thing. But there's also stuff like stained glass that's on there, and like small scale backyard casting. So anything that has to do with learning a skill, like working with their hands, because I tell them that you might not have the money or the time to take a class with somebody. So we have this glorious thing called the internet, and we have books and magazines, and we have tutorials that people have done. So me learning stained glass was taking what my dad had shown me about, you know, like soldering stuff and about cutting glass, evolved into the, I really want to learn how to do that. I don't have time myself, and I don't know in this area who's going to do it. I can figure this out. So it was the reading the books, it was watching the videos, and it was a lot of like trial and error. And so that's, you know, how that came about.
I love that, because you're not just teaching a skill, you're teaching a mindset to learn skills, which is something that is invaluable.
Right. It's like your button fell off. Now you know how to put it back on.
Yeah.
Instead of like, yeah, I don't know how to fix this hole. No.
But I can go learn how to have the skill. And then that's the thing that I think it wouldn't hold anyone back from being able to go learn anything then, because you've just opened that door. And
Right.
that, I think, that's awesome.
And then it's a lot of fun because I make them do like they have to check in, like they're doing the research now, then they have to experiment. They can't just like expect to like bust out a blouse, you know. I had a student one semester that she went to Goodwill and got a bunch of clothes, and that she wound up figuring out how to hem them to fit her. And so it's something as basic as that. I'm like, you learned how to do something on your own. You know,
Yeah.
There's a lot that I know how to do. I can sew. I'm not great at it, but I know how to hem my pair of pants, and I can make a quilt, and I can do like the basic stuff. It's like nobody's going to show you how. You're not always going to have somebody that can show you how to do stuff. And it's like, don't be so helpless. And so at the end of the semester, they get to put together a little PowerPoint or Prezi or PDF presentation where they go, this is what I learned about the sewing machine. This is the history of it. And look, I found this really old photo of this really old piece that was crocheted, you know, and then they show us the experiments. And then at the end, this is what I made. And everybody's like, oh my God, that's so awesome. And it is fun because at the end, they're like, yeah, I did that. And I'm like, it's adult show and tell. That's what I tell them. It is show and tell for adults. We're not going to critique you on it. Mm-hmm. We just want to see what you did. What did you learn? Show us what you learned.
That's really a fun part of it too. Not just showing it, but seeing what other people have done. I love that part.
Yeah, and it's great. You know, I'm like, okay, this is 3D, which means you can't just like crochet a scarf. Make a stuffed animal or something.
I see.
3-dimensional, because you can't just like knit something that's flat. Like, yeah, you can, once you get that going, you're good. So you have to at least do something that makes it more I'm like, yes, philosophy wise, it is 3-dimensional because like we're not getting into that. I'm like, a piece of paper is flat, okay, but technically it's 3-dimensional. So like we kind of laugh and talk about that. Like, no, you can do this. It's like you can make a hat because that's more 3-dimensional, but just like a long piece, no. Do something. You got to do a little bit more than that. Challenge yourself.
I am going to wait for the day for when you come back on the show and you tell us about the person that designed an entire runway that is now premiering in New York.
Yeah, that would be great. I actually had a student that went off to, she got her undergraduate degree in art and wound up going to the Art Institute of Chicago for fashion design.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
So we do get a lot of students that tend to do that. And so it was one of the things, like, I don't know. So in the cabinet, you can see like the little square pieces up at the top. I told her that, and you can, feel free to disagree. But I'm like, a blouse is a blouse, and it could be like amazing, but sometimes it can be too over the top, and sometimes just the simplicity of like the embroidery on the sleeve or the embroidery on the collar is what will make it. And if that's that extra little thing that can go into that piece, it'll elevate it, which falls back into that Art Nouveau. It's like that extra tiny little thing that's off to the side that like, oh, it's great, it's beautiful, it's amazing. But then you're like, oh my God, look at that like dragonfly that's down here that you didn't notice, that you really had to work with it and pay attention to it. Like that little tiny thing down there will make that piece. If it wasn't there, then it wouldn't work very well.
And yeah, that is very true for fashion design. There are a few designers out there that become known for one little detail, like who was it, Trey, that had the extra pleat in the sleeve of the dress shirt right at the cuff? It was I'm not going to think of it. It was a whole, they had their own store like up at South Park. Anyway, and there was a designer that put like extra buttons on the cuff of the suit and things like that. So little details like that.
Was it Pronto?
No,
Oil?
it's its own brand and store. It's kind of like Johnston and Murphy for shoes, but these were like clothes.
All right,
It wasn't a brand that I'll think of it. I'll think of it.
Okay. Well, we'll put it up on Patreon after.
I can't believe I even brought it up, not being able to think of the name of it. But little details like that were like, so when it becomes recognizable too. So like if somebody walked in with that dress shirt and I saw the pleats, I would know what brand they're wearing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing, is that when you try to teach students, it's like right now, at least where I'm at, because they are freshmen, sophomore, they're going to be all over the place style wise. Like it's not until you get to be a senior and you start developing a thesis, and when you get into grad school, that you really develop that you want your work to be known. That I recognize that piece. We can recognize a green and green like piece of furniture. We can recognize a Mucha poster. We can recognize these things. We don't even need to know. We can recognize a Toulouse-Lautrec painting because of that particular style. They aren't doing it, or didn't do it, to where, okay, I have this formula and I know that it was successful, so I'm going to keep doing it. It's a style. It's like you grow into that style, and your style changes and evolves as you yourself evolve as an artist.
Yeah. It was Brooks Brothers, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah.
Dang.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's just, I every now and then I would see somebody with this extra pleat and I'd go, I know where you got that shirt.
Yeah, right.
Not to call them out or anything, just it was kind of this neat little detail that became recognizable to me. So yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like when you see, as well as fashion too, like you have the like the Alexander McQueen, or you have the different designers where they're known for this particular style, Christian Siriano, and
right.
My mind's going blank at some of them, but in my head I know. Why can't I think of names tonight? I don't know.
I don't know, but I do tell my students sometimes, they're like, I don't know if I could do this. And I'm like, make it work.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, who cares if you don't make it work? The question is, what did you learn? And you learned all of these things that will make you better. So even if you're not totally proficient at the end, what did you learn?
Yep, exactly. When I do a critique with students, that is the last question. Like it's always the same formula in my class. Like, what did you like best about this project? What do you like the least about it? What is successful? What do you need to resolve? And then the very last question, I'm like, in famous last words, if I had to do this project over again, I would, like, how would you approach it differently? Because I tell them that in order to be like a really good artist, it's not about getting your piece perfect the first time. It's the learning from it and going, you know what, this is a good design, but next time I should do this because I think that would be really cool. And it's like, and it's not that what you've done right now isn't cool.
Mhm.
It's a successful artist is going to always want to push themselves to better themselves, both technique wise and like visually, like artist wise, like art wise, like what they make. They always want to get better, better, better. Because if you're content to just like throw something out there, then what's the point?
Yeah. Stretching and growing is part of the process.
It's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. You look like you were about to say something, Trey.
I have something pondering in the back of my brain, but it's not a fully fledged statement or question. So
Okay.
we will let it come to fruition first.
I want to know, like, because you deal with a lot of beginners. You deal with people who are just starting out in this journey. What is some of the advice you end up giving out the most, or maybe what you see as the most valuable?
Well, just what I saw today. The like, don't be so hard on yourselves. Like that, like everybody when they're first starting out, they have this idea, this vision in their head of what they want to do, but yet their hands don't work well. Like they work, but it doesn't like there's a disconnect between what they see in their brain and what they can physically do. Like you can't do that yet, and that is okay. But don't get frustrated at not being able to do that yet. Like, so don't be so hard on yourself. That being said, there's also the society, like we're so instant in our society now. Like the joys, like who would have thought like 20 years ago that we would be doing this? Like sitting in front of a computer and then like, oh, look, I got a webcam and this is great. We can do this. Whereas, undergraduate school for me, it was the oh my God, the internet's a big thing, dial up. And then it's like you're waiting and you're like, oh my God, this is great. And you're like, no, like for years it was always the don't, nope, slides, they're gonna go away. It took like 30 years for slides to go away and for the digital camera to be accessible. So like give it time. It'll be fine. Don't be so hard on yourself, but yet hold yourself at least to standards of craftsmanship, and not in the sense of it has to be perfect, but that you will try to do the best that you can. And don't use the excuse, well, I tried, as the cop out for not really trying. And don't like this rush of trying to get something done as quickly as possible. Like a good piece of artwork can, like, I don't know, you can spend 200 hours working on one outfit, but you don't really want to be spending 200 hours. But maybe 20 years ago you would, but you've cut that time in half, or even like to where it only takes you 40 hours now that took you 200 hours years ago. It's like, so don't think that you have to rush through something. Like it's so instant that they don't want to put the time into doing something really well. Like, well, I have work and I've got all these other classes and I have this. And I'm like, all I hear are excuses, and I get it, but don't spread yourself so thin. So it's like this teeter totter of cut yourself some slack, but yet hold yourself to a higher standard kind of thing. It's like, you got to figure out how to balance those things right now in your life. And yet you still have family that you have to deal with. You still have work to deal with in order to pay for school and all that kind of stuff. So it's the work on early on, trying to balance all of that and try to figure out what works best for you. And I'm like, you know what? Not that I condone getting C's in your classes. It's like, but if you're going to go into the field of art, you shouldn't be happy with a C in an art class. Like that's just how it is. Like get the C in your English class. And if I were an English professor, and I would be like, don't you dare get a C in English class, get a C in the art class. Like you have to focus on the things that are the most important. And if you're going to get a degree in art, then art is what's important. And the only way to get better is to figure out that balance.
If it matters, you'll find a way.
Yeah, exactly. If it's important enough to you, you'll do it. If you have to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning, hopefully not. Hopefully you budgeted your time a little bit better. But instead of like endlessly scrolling on your phone or watching a show or something, do your work. Do some art. You should be happy. You're making art. And I tell them, I'm like, if they complain, like, oh my God, this is so hard. Because their first project in my 3D class, I have them carve crayons. Like the Crayola crayons with an X-Acto. So they have to like carve these little non-objective crayons, and you still keep the top of the crayon, keep the bottom of the crayon. So these tiny little like things of wax, and then they break. And I'm like, I give you this because you cannot rush this project. You can't finish it in like 10 minutes. It's not going to happen. It's like you got to breathe. And you have to understand that sometimes things break and that you have to start over again. Sometimes you can make it work. Sometimes you can't make it work. Sometimes, well, that fabric is horrible. Let me just throw this away and start a different one. Yeah. But you should still be happy that you are making art and carving a crayon and ruining something in art than spending time in another class that does not interest you at all.
There were so many times that I would sit down and curse the fabric that I was working with to make my Renaissance costumes. I love that fabric so immensely, but it was one of the most difficult things that I have ever worked with in my entire life. And then I got to the end of it, and I saw it completed, and I went, holy expletive, I love this so much. And so there are going to be times where you're going to just have to tell yourself to trust the process. And that's one of those times.
And keep picturing the end. I think that helps me too, is what does this look like when it's done? And how excited am I in that moment? Okay, now I'm motivated to work harder and to push for that.
Yeah, there's that little cartoon that has like, the life of an artist type thing. Like, in the beginning you're like all happy and whatnot. And then like you kind of like, let me just kind of put this to the side because I'm gonna forget about it. And then all of a sudden you're like, then all the work while crying, even though you had this much time to work on it. This is how much on the little chart, all the work while crying. We don't want to cry, but it will happen sometimes. And then at the end you're like, okay, I impressed myself. That's good.
Well, Jennifer, I got to say that this last hour has flown by. But I do have two last questions for you. So if you'll indulge me for two last minute things. These two questions we like to ask everybody. So first, you were sitting down at a table having lunch, and who is going to be the other person sitting across from you at that lunch table? They can be alive or dead.
Okay, providing that I remember my French, it would be Toulouse-Lautrec.
Ooh, why Toulouse?
I absolutely there's something about his paintings that I love. And maybe because it's like, the little can girls and things like that. But it's like that was like prior to me. It's the same time period as Art Nouveau. So it's kind of like his posters and from that time period that I think is what drew me into Art Nouveau. And plus his life is just fascinating.
Okay. All right. I think that's the first time that I've heard Toulouse as an answer, so I love that.
I think so. Yeah.
And then the other one, you had given some advice earlier on, but I want to be more specific to those that are just getting started in art. They're not, they haven't declared it as major. They're just stepping into it for the first time. What advice would you give to them?
Have fun and have joy with small things like getting a brand new pencil sharpener. Like have fun with the art supplies, have fun experimenting with it, and be open to any of the instruction that your instructors have. because everybody's going to give you different advice, but we're here to point out things that you don't see yet. And so if you are open to having us point out those things, then you'll be fine. So just trust the process and go with it.
That's great advice. Thank
Solid.
you.
Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, I really got to say thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today. I love this conversation, and I think this week I'm going to be thinking a lot about form versus function.
Yes.
And I'm going to be yelling at my leader, no, it needs form and function.
Yep.
And he's going to just go, what are you talking about? And be like, watch the podcast.
Yeah.
I think that should be our homework this week is notice the form and function in the things surrounding you.
The pen that you write with. Form and function.
I like that because I like saying there's art in everything and people question me on it, and I'll bring up their pen as a prime example. Someone had to design it. Someone had to figure out what color that was going to be and the shape of the clip and whether it was going to click or whether it was going to have a cap. Those are all things that go into making a pen besides it just being a writing tool.
The car that you drive, the clothes that you wear, every single little thing that you have in your life was designed by an artist.
Yeah.
Yep.
Everything.
Well, art is in everything. Art is in you. So thank you so much for tuning in to watch us here at the Modern Romantic Podcast. We want to let you know that you can find additional conversations and behind-the-scenes content on Patreon. Follow us there under the Mod Rom. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a great evening, and remember, art is in everything. Bye, everybody.